any composer or songwriter, chromaticism is one of the most valuable tools we can have in our toolkit because it allows us to paint with more colors, experiment with complexity, and break out of predictable patterns. In part 1 of this video series, we focused on taking a chromatic approach to riff writing and melody making, as well as looking at some applications that can be very useful when improvising. In this video, I want to talk about adding a little chromatic magic to your chord progressions and focus on how to get creative when choosing the perfect chords to serve your purpose. So let's start by looking at how a chromatic line can connect two chords. And in this case, we'll look at a major chord moving down to its relative minor. So here we have a D major moving down to a B minor. So we have this chromatic descending line in play where we can go hitting the two chromatic notes between the departure note and the destination note. So we're leaving from D, we're ending up in B, and along the way we're going to hit a D flat, a C, and then land on B. So you can put this in context with a little rhythmic groove. We can of course go the other way, reversing the chromatic run, and start with the B minor landing on the D. Now, if that move sounds familiar, it's because we hear it in a lot of different songs. And the one that really jumps out as a great example is Sitting on the Dock of the Bay, written by Otis Redding and Steve Cropper. 3, 4. Sitting in the morning sun, I'll be sitting till the evening comes, watching the ships roll in, and I watch them roll away again. So in this case, we're starting on G, and our ascending run is between the A chord and the B chord. And we're playing them all as major or dominant chords. So there's some borrowed sounds in there. But the most important thing to note is the root movement. And we're moving here between the 2 and the 3 chromatically. So we're going via the flat third. 1. And there's that 2, flat 3, 3 movement. And then we go to the 4 chord. And now we descend from the 4 back down to the 2. So it's a reverse of that initial ascending line. And this idea of chromatically connecting chords in a sequence is really useful because it can be used in a variety of different contexts. So if we're in a blues, and we'll stay in the key of G, we may wish to connect the 4 chord and the 5 chord with that sharp 4 or flat 5 in between, which is part of the blues scale, so it fits. And you've heard that a bunch of times as well, I'm sure. So in that case, we're just moving between the 4 and the 5 chord. But we can do the same thing with the flat 7 chord moving back up to the root. So here we'll start on the G, go to the 4 chord, flat 7. And we do a little chromatic run back up to the root using dominant 7 chords. So this idea of connecting 2 chords, either a tone apart or a minor third apart, very common, really useful, and gives us that lovely sense of movement, but also gives us some extra color in the chord progression to play with. Let's move on to line clichés. Line clichés are a beautiful way to use chromatic movement because here we generally have a chord where all the notes in the chord stay where they are, but one of the notes moves chromatically. And you hear this kind of thing a lot in Latin music, for example. There we have the root descending and the other notes in the chords stay where they are. So you have the root note descending by a semitone, another semitone, another semitone. It's a beautiful sound. Another great sound is when we move the fifth down instead of the root, and that gives us the James Bond sound. So there's two examples of how chromaticism through line cliches can actually give us some of the most recognized and iconic sounds in our musical language. They're not just odd little moments that get thrown in here and there. They're actually serving a very important function, and that is to grab the ear, give us something unusual, and give us something that sticks in the memory. Now, another way we can look at chromaticism is with a technique I call filling in the gaps. And to understand this, let's go back and just have a look at the diatonic system and understand that in a diatonic chordal system, we have 7 chords, 7 notes. But in the Western music system, there are 12 notes in total. So that leaves 5 notes left to play with. So we have our C major as our 1, D minor as our 2, E minor as our 3, F major as our 4, G major as our 5, A minor as our 6, B diminished as our 7, and back home. Those are the 7 chords in our diatonic system. And what we can now do is take those remaining 5 notes and we can put a chord on each of those, focusing primarily on using a diminished chord. And so we'll start by just looking at where the gaps are first. If we start with our 1 chord, in this case C, and we move to our 2, that's a D minor. In between there, we have the flat 2 or the sharp 1. The D flat or the C sharp. So there's our first gap. If we then move to our 2 chord and our 3 chord, we have a gap between them as well. We have the flat 3 or the sharp 2. In this case, it's a D sharp or an E flat. We have no gap between the 3 chord and the 4 chord, semitone. But now we're at an F chord, and if we come back up here, the 5 chord is our G, which means we have a sharp 4 in between them. In this case, it's an F sharp or a G flat. We then have the 5 chord going to the 6 minor, the relative minor, which allows a gap there as well, the sharp 5 or the flat 6. So it's a G sharp or an A flat. We then go from the A minor to the B diminished, which leaves the gap of the flat 7, because that's the major 7. So in this case, it's the B flat or the A sharp. And then that brings us back home to C. Now look what happens when we put a diminished chord on those notes in the gaps. Now I changed it up a little bit at the end there because when we get to the relative minor, the A minor, if I then put a diminished chord on the flat 7, the next chord, the 7th note, is also a diminished. And so having the 2 of them there together doesn't really work. So that's where we can get a little bit creative and improvise a little. And in that case, I used a dominant 7 chord. From the A minor, I went to a B flat dominant. Then I hit a B diminished, and then I came home to C. And there's other variations that we can create between that relative minor and that home chord at the end. But for now, let's just look at what the function of those diminished chords are. And if you want to look at the functions of chords in general in a diatonic progression, here's a video that I made that really outlines the function of all 7 chords in a diatonic system. And there's also another one that looks at the relative minor and how those chords function and the relationships between them. But once we've established those relationships, now that we've got these diminished chords in between, they're actually serving their own very interesting function and pulling us to the next chord in the sequence. So if I had a C chord as the 1 going to a D minor chord as the 2, that C sharp diminished in between them, I can actually see as an A7 flat 9. Because when you play a diminished chord in this position, you can see that that there is a C sharp diminished, but that is an A7 being played off the C sharp. So they're only one note different. So by going from the 1 to the flat 2 or the sharp 1 diminished and then to the 2 chord, you are essentially creating this kind of move. You're setting up a 5-1 pull to the next chord in the sequence, but you're doing it chromatically. And that's why it works functionally. So, substitute for a 5 pulling us to the D minor. Substitute for a 5 pulling us now to the E minor. The F is a semitone away. Substitute for a 5 pulling us to the G. Substitute for the 5 pulling us now to the A minor. Going into a dominant chord outside sound, hitting our diminished B and coming back home to C. So that's how we get to use all 12 notes in a diatonic system to add color. Because if we're using the 7 notes of a diatonic system, it's a beautiful sound, and sometimes that's all that's required depending on the type of song we're writing. But in other situations, we want to add those colors. We want to have those options to play with. And we may want to have that chromatic movement to either create tension or delay resolution, or to just surprise the ear a little. Now, using the whole sequence and all 12 notes in a row is not very applicable, and we don't hear that happen very often. But here's a little bridge that I wrote to a song where I just wanted to take a section of it and have that section chromatic. And it's a song called In Every Country. It's played fairly up-tempo, and so I wanted to use the bounciness of the rhythm in combination with these chords moving chromatically. So we're in the key of A, but we start this movement on a D major 7, the 4 chord. And then we go to a D sharp diminished. And then we go to an E9. Then we go to an F diminished. And then we go to an F sharp minor 9. So that whole sequence there is chromatic, except when I get to the F sharp minor 9, or the F sharp minor 7, I play it down the octave. That's the move, but I do it this way. And so when played at tempo, it has this sound. The rest of the sequence is moving non-chromatically, it's moving diatonically. But for that particular section, I wanted to drag it out and delay the resolution. And that's a beautiful way of arriving. We're starting on a D major chord or a D major 7, and we're arriving at an F sharp minor. But we're going through this lovely chromatic sequence. You can also hear that it gives it a jazzy feel, and if you do write in this kind of genre or this kind of style, these chord maneuvers become really useful and a lot of fun to play with. Now let's talk about something called tritone substitution, and this is one of those really elegant ways we see chromaticism used. If we look at what is commonly referred to as a 2-5-1, and we'll stay in the key of C. A 2-5-1 in the key of C would be D minor, G7, C major, or C major 7. And so what we have there, if we look at the root notes, we have the D, the G, and the C. Now, what a tritone substitution allows us to do is target that 5 chord, that G7, And instead of playing the G, we go up 3 tones. So tritone is where the tritone substitution comes from. 3 tones up from G, if we go up 1 tone, we get an A. If we go up another tone, we get a B. If we go up another tone, we get a C sharp. So 3 tones away from G is a C sharp. Now, another position that we find C sharp is here. And so if we're going between D minor to a G7 and arriving at a C chord, that C sharp is now a chromatic note between the 2 chord, the D minor, and the 1 chord, the C major. So we can basically take the G7, apply the tritone substitution rule, and instead of playing a G7, we're going to play a C sharp 7. So you get this sound. Beautiful. And what's great about that is that you don't have to use it every time. So for variation, if you wanted to go the first time, D minor 9, G7, C major 7. And then the second time round, D minor 9, C sharp 7, and C major 7 to finish. And so the tritone substitution works exactly the same way if we're in a minor key. If we're trying to get back to the A minor, our 2 chord would be our B half diminished. And we'll play them as 4-note voicings here. So we're not thinking in triads. B half diminished would then go to an E7, which is our 5 chord, and brings us back to our A minor. So here, the gap between the 2 chord and the 1 chord is the flat 2 or the sharp 1, and that's going to be our tritone substitution. So here we have our 2 chord, B half diminished, B flat 7 to our A minor. Taking a chromatic approach to your songwriting doesn't have to always be front and center. Sometimes it's a textural ornamentation in the background. But here's a final way you may want to put it front and center. And this is when we're starting to consider the idea of walking bass line. And here's an example from a song I wrote called Little Black Mosquito. Oh, 1, 2, 3, 4. Black mosquito, you're incognito, but still I hear you coming into land. You're trying to take what's mine, so take your time tonight, fulfill that bloody purpose. We all want to be close to the ones that give us life, and suckle sweetly upon their souls like a parasite. So little black mosquito, stay a little while. And there's a lot of chords in there and it's moving around a fair bit, but the part that really makes use of this chromatic approach the most is the rise from the G all the way back up to the E minor. So chromaticism can be subtle, just a little moment that you throw into a lick or to a riff or to a melody. It can be the feature of the song, as in Dock of the Bay, where you've really created a bass line that grabs the ear and takes us between 2 chords in an interesting way. It can be used to fill in the gaps between what would normally be a fairly predictable diatonic system, or it can be used, as we just heard, in a fairly extreme way where you're taking a jazz approach, lots of walking bass line movement, lots of chromatic runs, tritone substitutions, the whole works. So hopefully that gives you some new tools to work with and gives you a sense of how you can break the patterns that have become predictable for you with your own songwriting process. Good luck. See you soon.